I used to be a senior software engineer at Google until they fired me for doing something unforgivable, something so controversial that it was the #1 news story for days. My crime? I wrote an internal document that, among other things, suggested that men and women, on average, are different. Like I told you, unforgivable. The politically progressive viewpoint, which is dominant at Google and in the media, is that all disparities in society are due to injustices, or in this case, that the gender gap in tech is solely due to some form of sexism. But is this true? The politically correct answer is yes, and Google acts accordingly. It treats men and women differently during hiring and promotion, holds official women-only events, and gives mandatory sensitivity training on how to combat alleged sexist bias. Of course, all of this makes sense if sexism is indeed the sole cause of the imbalance. But what if men and women are not exactly the same? Then sexism is just one of many possible causes of the imbalance. And exclusionary programs and differential treatment can be a counterproductive form of sexism. These practices actually increase tensions and make some feel like Google cares more about their gender than their programming ability. As an engineer, when I'm faced with a problem, I want to solve it. So I decided to research the premise that men and women are exactly the same. I wrote my findings in a 10-page document titled Google's Ideological Echo Chamber. You can read it online. What did I discover? That not all of the male-female disparity in tech may be the result of sexism, that at least some of it may be attributed to men and women having different goals for their careers and their lives. To cite just 2 examples, in the study Women, Careers, and Work-Life Preferences, published in the British Journal of Guidance and Counseling, the study's authors conclude that women across populations tend to look for more work-life balance, while men tend to have a higher drive for status. And according to a study by Cal State Fullerton psychologist Richard Lippa, men, on average, tend to be more interested in things, while women tend to be more interested in people. These findings have been replicated many times. They've actually been cited by other researchers as a cause for the gender gap in tech. In other words, I didn't make this stuff up. In fact, after my document came under attack, evolutionary psychologist Jeffrey Miller said its empirical claims were scientifically accurate. But Google disagreed. Like, really disagreed. First, the company's newly appointed VP of Diversity, Integrity, and Governance, Danielle Brown, posted a memo that said my report advanced incorrect assumptions about gender. Google CEO Sundar Pichai sent a memo to all employees saying that I crossed the line by advancing harmful gender stereotypes. This was, he added, not okay. Then he fired me. By that point, much to my shock, my document had gone viral. News outlets were branding it an anti-diversity manifesto. But if they had read what I wrote, they could see for themselves that it was pro-diversity. I had suggested multiple ways that we could get more women into tech without resorting to counterproductive discrimination. Ironic, isn't it? The company that hires some of the smartest people in the world couldn't handle a well-reasoned scientific discussion. But my firing pales in comparison to the larger issue. Will Google force upon its users the same politically correct views that it forces upon its employees? The evidence is disturbing. Google already manipulates its products to fit a certain viewpoint. Just one example, YouTube, Google's video platform, restricts access to dozens of PragerU videos, along with videos made by other influential moderates and conservatives. Yes, Google is a business and can set its own policies, but for its billions of users, Google is their main gateway to information, the lens through which they view the world. This makes Google, in some ways, more powerful than even the government. And that means Google has a special responsibility to, well, simply follow its own motto, don't be evil. I'm James Damore for Prager University.
There are 2 important, indeed fundamental questions you have to answer in life. The first is there a God, specifically a moral and judging creator? The second is, are people basically good? Your answer to the second question will shape just about all of your moral, social, and political views, even more than whether you believe in God. That's why a believer and an atheist who have the same views about human nature almost always have the same social and political views. Let me give you some examples. You've probably heard the phrase, poverty causes crime. If you believe that people are basically good, you are likely to believe that poverty or bigotry or some other outside force causes people to commit violent crime. That's the only way you can make sense of the fact that some people commit crimes despite their basically good nature. Something drove them to it. But if you don't believe people are basically good, you're far more likely to blame the criminals themselves, not outside forces, for their actions. One more example. In a society where it is believed that people are basically good, parents in society don't devote great efforts toward making good people. After all, if we're born good, why do you have to teach goodness? On the other hand, those who don't believe we are born all that good understand that parents in society have to undertake major efforts to make children into good adults. Okay then, are people basically good? As I will show, given humanity's history, the answer should be obvious. Of course, human nature isn't basically good. Now, this doesn't mean that people are basically bad. We are born with real potential to do good, but we are not basically good. Take babies. Babies are lovable and innocent, but they're not good. They're entirely self-centered, as they have to be in order to survive. I want mommy, I want milk, I want to be held, I want to be comforted. And if you do not do all these things immediately, I will ruin your life. That's not goodness, that's narcissism. We are born narcissists, preoccupied with number one, ourselves. And if you've ever worked with kids, you know how cruel, how bullying they can be. And don't parents have to tell their child tens of thousands of times, say thank you? Now, why is that? If we're naturally good, wouldn't feeling and expressing gratitude come naturally? And then there is the historical record. Evils, huge evils affecting much of the human race have been the norm. Here goes just a few examples. The Ottoman Turks targeted millions of Armenian Christians for death during World War I. The German Nazi regime murdered 6 million Jews, 2 out of every 3 European Jews, including more than 1 million children and babies. The Soviet communist regime slaughtered about 5 million Ukrainians and about 25 million other innocents. The Chinese communists killed about 70 million Chinese and enslaved the rest of the Chinese people. The North Korean communist regime has built what one can only call the world's largest concentration camp, most of North Korea. In post-colonial Congo in the decade between 1998 and 2008, over 5 million people were murdered and tens, if not hundreds of thousands of women raped. Of course, before that, about 10 million Africans were kidnapped and made slaves in the European slave trade, and another 10 to 18 million Africans were enslaved by Arab slave traders. And let me ask you this. If people are basically good, why does every civilization have so many laws to control human behavior? Knowing all this, those who believe that people are basically good have simply made a decision to believe that and ignore all the evidence. Why do people commit evil? Because it's easy to, because it's tempting to, and yes, because it often accords with human nature. That is why figuring out how to make good people is the single most important project in all of human life. But first, you have to believe it's necessary. I'm Dennis Prager.
A lot of the things that are wrong with the world, we can't fix by ourselves. As much as we'd like to see peace brought to troubled areas, corrupt governments reformed, cancers cured, there's a limited amount that any of us as individuals can do about such things. However, there is one thing that nearly all of us can do that will immediately and exponentially increase goodness and happiness on earth. Parents and all other adults should reserve their highest praise of children for when their children do kind acts. That is not the case at present. As a rule, children receive their highest compliments for one of four things: their intellectual and academic achievements. My son Sean is brilliant. His teacher says he's the best student she's had in years. Their athletic abilities, their artistic attainments, and in the case of girls, their looks. Children who receive their parents' and other adults' compliments in these areas are delighted. Everyone loves compliments. But what about the child who doesn't excel at academics, who isn't a gifted athlete or dancer, the girl who is not particularly pretty? About what will their parents praise them? The most flattering remark such a child is likely to hear their parents tell others will be something like, "But he or she is a really good kid," from which it can generally be inferred that being a good kid is not a big deal. That from the parent's perspective, the child is probably not very good at anything worth talking about. Some parents to whom I've made this proposal have told me it's unnecessary. They're certain that they have successfully communicated to their children that being a good person is what really matters most to them. By and large, these parents are deluding themselves. And there is a way for parents to find out if this is so. For many years, Dennis Prager has suggested that parents ask their children, "What do you think that I, your mother, or I, your father, most want you to be? Successful, smart, good, or happy?" Many parents who have conducted this experiment have been quite surprised to learn that their children did not think that being good was what mattered most to their parents. Try it yourself. Ask your child of any age that question: "What do you think I most want you to be?" I want to make it clear, I am not suggesting that parents stop complimenting their children for their accomplishments in other areas. All children want to know that their parents have respect for their accomplishments, and girls, even more than boys, also need to feel that they are physically attractive. But, and this is an important but, what I'm suggesting is this: the traits that we most often emphasize and praise are all important only if being a good person is placed at the top of the list. But then you might say, don't these traits have a value in and of themselves, independent of goodness? The answer is no, they don't. Germany did not start World War II and carry out the Holocaust because it lacked intelligence or cultured people, but because it lacked enough good people. Now, what do I mean when I speak about young people being good? Let me cite a few examples. Speaking out against and confronting a school bully. Befriending a new kid at school who isn't popular.
Hi.
Finding a wallet or cell phone and making every effort to locate the owner instead of keeping it. Offering one's seat on a bus to an older person.
Thank you.
Treating one's siblings decently. Not cheating on tests. And much more. Note, however, I didn't list among my examples going on a 10K walk for a good cause like cancer research. That is, of course, a very worthwhile thing for a young person to do. But it's not really what I'm talking about. I'm talking about individual, one-to-one acts of goodness, of integrity. Why will parents reserving their highest praise for their child's goodness and integrity have so powerful an impact? Because children will then ultimately identify feeling good about themselves with being a good person. They will most like themselves when they act nobly. Or to put it another way, their self-esteem will come more from their goodness than from anything else. What a world that would be. And the best news about this proposal is that you can start doing it immediately. And I don't mean tomorrow, I mean now. I'm Joseph Telushkin for Prager University.
In every presidential election, only one question matters. Which candidate will get the 270 votes needed to win the Electoral College? Our founders so deeply feared a tyranny of the majority that they rejected the idea of a direct vote for president. That's why they created the Electoral College. For more than 2 centuries, it has encouraged coalition building, given a voice to both big and small states, and discouraged voter fraud. Unfortunately, there is now a well-financed, below-the-radar effort to do away with the Electoral College. It is called National Popular Vote, or NPV, and it wants to do exactly what the founders rejected: award the job of president to the person who gets the most votes nationally. Even if you agree with this goal, it's hard to agree with their method. Rather than amend the Constitution, which they have no chance of doing, NPV plans an end run around it. Here's what NPV does. It asks states to sign a contract to give their presidential electors to the winner of the national popular vote instead of the winner of the state's popular vote. What does that mean in practice? It means that if NPV had been in place in 2004, for example, when George W. Bush won the national vote, California's electoral votes would have gone to Bush, even though John Kerry won that state by 1.2 million votes. Can you imagine strongly Democratic California calmly awarding its electors to a Republican? Another problem with NPV's plan is that it robs states of their sovereignty. A key benefit of the Electoral College system is that it decentralizes control over the election. Currently, a presidential election is really 51 separate elections, one in each state and one in D.C. These 51 separate processes exist side by side in harmony. They do not and cannot interfere with each other. California's election code applies only to California and determines that state's electors. So a vote cast in Texas can never change the identity of a California elector. NPV would disrupt this careful balance. It would force all voters into one national election pool. Thus, a vote cast in Texas will always affect the outcome in California. And the existence of a different election code in Texas always has the potential to unfairly affect a voter in California. Why? Because state election codes can differ drastically. States have different rules about early voting, registering to vote, and qualifying for the ballot. They have different policies regarding felon voting. They have different triggers for recounts. Each and every one of these differences is an opportunity for someone, somewhere, to file a lawsuit claiming unfair treatment. Why should a voter in New York get more or less time to early vote than a voter in Florida? Why should a hanging Chad count in Florida but not in Ohio? The list of possible complaints is endless. And think of the opportunities for voter fraud if NPV is passed. Currently, an attempt to steal a presidential election requires phony ballots to appear or real ballots to disappear in the right state or combination of states, something that is very hard to anticipate. But with NPV, voter fraud anywhere can change the election results. No need to figure out which states you must swing, just add or subtract the votes you need, or don't want, wherever you can most easily get away with it. And finally, if NPV is adopted, and winning is only about getting the most votes, a candidate might concentrate all of his efforts in the biggest cities or the biggest states. We could see the end of presidential candidates who care about the needs and concerns of people in smaller states or outside of big cities. Here's why all of this is of so much concern. NPV is more than halfway to its goal. NPV's contract will go into effect when states with a combined 270 electoral votes have signed. To date, NPV already has the support of 10 states plus D.C. Together, that's 165 electoral votes, leaving only 105 votes to go. It is time to stop this attempt to undo the way American presidents are elected, which will in turn undo America. The people behind NPV think they are wiser than every generation of Americans that preceded them. They aren't. I'm Tara Ross for Prager University.
What are the 5 biggest issues facing blacks in America? Here's my list. Problem number 5, the victim mentality. Nothing holds someone back more than seeing himself as a victim. Why? Because a victim is not responsible for his situation. Everything is someone else's fault. And the victim sees little chance of improving his life. How can he get ahead if someone is holding him back? All this makes the victim unhappy, frustrated, and angry. This is how too many blacks see themselves, as victims. So much so that their victim status becomes their primary identity and their ruling ideology. I call it victimology. Unfortunately, many black churches preach this victimology. Many black parents pass it on to their children, inner city schools teach it to their students, and the black media reinforce it. Meanwhile, the NAACP and other black grievance groups fundraise on it. Problem number 4, Lack of diversity. Blacks repeatedly demand an honest dialogue or debate about race. But how can there ever be an honest dialogue about race between blacks and whites when there is virtually no honest dialogue between blacks and blacks? It's hypocritical. And if a black doesn't think whites are ultimately responsible for black people's problems, they're labeled a sellout, Uncle Tom, or race traitor. As long as this type of groupthink exists, race reverence of the Al Sharpton, Jesse Jackson type will continue to be celebrated, while independent black thinkers such as Professors Thomas Sowell and Walter Williams will be shunned. The honest race dialogue and debate that first has to happen is not between blacks and whites, but between blacks and blacks. We demand diversity from others, but need to practice it ourselves where it really matters, in thought, opinion, and even political affiliation. Problem number 3, urban terrorism. As just about everyone knows, but too few talk about publicly, in majority black cities, violent black-on-black crime is rampant. A Department of Justice study from 1980 through 2008 revealed that blacks accounted for almost half of the nation's homicide victims, 47.4%, and more than half of the offenders, 52.4%, all while being 13% of America's population. The Tuskegee Institute conducted a study of all known lynchings of blacks that occurred between 1882 through 1968. During this 86-year span, which is essentially the post-Civil War era up to the Civil Rights era, 3,446 blacks were reportedly lynched. Presently, black-on-black murder eclipses the number of blacks lynched over the course of 80 years, roughly every 6 months. Unbelievably, the culpability for this disproportionate amount of mayhem actually lies with a menacing 2 to 3% minority within the black populace. I call them urban terrorists. And since they're literally spawned from problem number 2, the black community protects them. Problem number 2, proliferation of baby mamas. The disintegration of the nuclear family has led to an astronomical increase of single mother households. According to the Moynihan Report, in 1965, nearly 25% of black children were born to unwed mothers. The report's author, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, said this was a disaster in the making. He was, of course, vilified by so-called black leaders and their progressive allies. But he was right. Today, the out-of-wedlock birth rate is nearly 75% and even higher in some urban areas. To be clear, baby daddies share this responsibility with baby mamas. Yet, while baby daddies are blamed and rarely shown compassion, baby mamas are rarely blamed and receive both compassion and support. This lopsided dynamic and the previously listed pathologies stem directly from the number one problem facing the black community. Problem number 1, unquestioning allegiance to so-called progressive policies. Unwavering loyalty to progressive liberal policies is the primary reason these dire conditions persist. It both makes them possible and perpetuates them. It's no coincidence that progressivism is the common thread that binds predominantly black cities where single-parent homes, failing schools, rampant poverty, and crime predominate. Look at cities like Detroit, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. They've been run by progressive Democrats for decades. If their liberal policies were at all effective, these cities should have become models of economic growth and prosperity. Instead, they're models of dysfunction. By fostering and exploiting the victim mentality, discouraging self-examination, subsidizing baby mamas, and making excuses for black thugs, so-called progressive policies don't alleviate the problems that afflict the black community. They aggravate those problems. You may have noticed that racism did not make the list. Why not? It's simple. There will be no solution to the problems afflicting Black America until more blacks recognize that the issues plaguing our community are ultimately self-inflicted. Does racism exist? Sure, but there are other problems far more serious. And waiting until there are no more races will mean waiting and making excuses forever. I'm Talib Starks for Prager University.
G'day there. As an outsider, I have a unique perspective from which to view America. As an American friend said to me, sometimes it takes someone on the outside to remind us what we're like on the inside. I'm an Australian, you might have already guessed that, and I love my home country, and I am proud that my nation has long been a reliable American ally. But I know that Australia is not America, and that my country has not achieved what America has achieved. No country in human history has. What makes America different? There are many answers, but start with one you might not have thought of. Most people think America is all about success. I see it a little differently. I think America is all about failing. Most people in the world don't get the chance to fail, but Americans take it for granted. Only Americans say, if at first you don't succeed, try again. There's even an academic study to prove this. According to a study by Harvard Business School professor Stephen Rogers, most entrepreneurs fail 4 times before they succeed. Success takes timing and hard work, some good luck, many other factors. But to succeed, you must be given the chance to fail, and you must accept responsibility if you do. I love that about Americans. At their best, they don't blame others. They learn from their mistakes and do better the next time. And in America, there's almost always a next time. Nowhere else are you as free to take entrepreneurial risks. Talk to someone who has tried to start a small business in Germany or Brazil, and you'll see what I mean. From the outside looking in, I can only admire this. And I'm not the only one. Just take a look at the CEOs of major Silicon Valley companies. You will see the names of entrepreneurs from all over the world: India, Pakistan, Russia, Israel, you name the country. Why did they come to America to innovate? Because there's a lot of money here? Yes, of course, that's part of it. But there's a lot of money in London and Berlin and Tokyo as well. They came to America because America gave them the chance to fail, and therefore the best chance in the world to succeed. And the rest of the world can thank their lucky stars for America's economic success. Not only is America by far the world's largest economy, it is also the world's largest consumer. And the world's economy depends on being able to sell to America. It would also be perfectly natural for Americans to want to keep all this wealth to themselves, but they don't. Just the opposite, in fact. America has been the most selfless nation in the history of the world. Yet another way in which America is different. What other nation fights for the freedom of others? In Europe, in 2 world wars, in Korea, in Vietnam, and yes, in Iraq. In all those wars, America had very little or nothing to gain economically. Whenever there is a humanitarian crisis anywhere in the world, Haiti after a hurricane, Indonesia after a tsunami, who is the first to rush aid to these places? No matter where the calamity is, at home or abroad, Americans invariably raise millions of dollars almost instantly to send food and clothing and supplies to people in distress they don't know and will never meet. Who else does that? I love that America is different. What worries me about America is that I see her increasingly trying to act like other nations. It worries me to see that so many Americans are drawn to the ossified ideas of Europe. That's the old world. It was old in 1776 even, when America broke away from it. Why would America want to reverse its own revolution? Why would Americans want to follow the economic and social model of a continent that they can see is failing economically and socially? Do Americans really want to emulate France or Greece? It worries me to see so many Americans wallowing in victim status, blaming outside forces for their predicament, rather than accepting responsibility and seeking to improve themselves. It worries me to see American schools debasing America's own glorious history. It worries me to see America's debt and government grow larger while its military and its personal freedoms shrink. It worries me because a weak, self-doubting America is bad for everyone, everywhere, who loves freedom. But these worries never last long, because each time I visit America, I encounter a people who are confident, competitive, courageous, faithful, idealistic, innovative, inspirational, charitable, and optimistic. It's like no other place in the world. I pray it stays that way. I'm Nick Adams for Prager University.
In 2011, a solar power company called Solyndra declared bankruptcy. A company going bankrupt is not news, but Solyndra was not just any company. Its biggest investor was the federal government, which had given it $500 million. That was news. But really, it shouldn't have been. If history is any guide, it was quite predictable. The government is a very poor investor, and always has been. There are countless examples, but two should serve our purpose here. After the Civil War, American leaders were anxious to bind the country's north, south, east, and west regions together with transcontinental railroads. Congress, therefore, gave massive federal aid to build the Union Pacific, the Central Pacific, and later the Northern Pacific railroads. But all three of these roads had huge financial problems. The Union Pacific, for example, was mired in financial scandal from its inception, went bankrupt several times, and had to rebuild large sections of track thanks to shoddy construction practices. At that same time, James J. Hill, with no federal aid whatsoever, built a railroad from St. Paul to Seattle, the Great Northern. How was Hill able to do with private funds what the Union Pacific failed to do with the gift of tens of millions of federal dollars? The starting point is incentives. The Union Pacific was paid by the government for each mile of road it built. It was in the railroad's interest not to build the road straight. The more miles it took the UP to cross Nebraska, for example, the more money it made. Hill, by contrast, used his own capital. To make a profit, he had to build his Great Northern Railroad sturdy and straight. Hill's company remained in business for almost 100 years until 1970 when it merged with other railroads. The original Union Pacific, riddled with corruption and numerous other financial misdeeds, including the wholesale bribery of public officials, went broke within 10 years. The story of the airplane is even more stark. By the opening of the 20th century, the major nations of Europe and America were frantically at work trying to invent a flying machine. The first nation to do so would have a huge military and commercial advantage. In fact, leading American politicians of the day, such as Teddy Roosevelt, President William McKinley, and others, argued that building an airplane was a national emergency. There was no time, they argued, to wait for private industry to get the job done. The government needed to pick the best aeronautics expert and give him the money he needed. That expert was Samuel Langley, the president of the prestigious Smithsonian Institution and holder of honorary degrees from Harvard, Yale, Oxford, and Cambridge. Langley was already an accomplished inventor, and he had written a highly praised book, Experiments in Aerodynamics. Federal officials gave Langley funds for 2 trial flights. He immediately set to work. His theory was that his plane needed to be thrust into the air from a houseboat on the Potomac River. The big engine on the plane would then propel it through the air for several minutes. When his first attempt failed and the plane splashed into the river, Langley was not deterred. But when his second flight did no better, Langley and the politicians gave up. If Langley, with the full backing of the government, could not solve the problem, people simply assumed that it could not be solved. Indeed, the New York Times wrote that human flight might take 1,000,000 years to accomplish. But to everyone's surprise, 9 days after Langley's failure, the Wright brothers, Orville and Wilbur, 2 bicycle mechanics from Dayton, Ohio, with $2,000 of their own money, conquered the air. On a beach at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, they flew the first plane. Within 5 years, they had constructed an aircraft suitable to sell to the government for military defense. Langley's subsidized failure was similar to that of the Union Pacific, and the Wright brothers' success resembled that of James J. Hill and the Great Northern Railroad. Langley and the Union Pacific were using other people's money. They did not spend it as carefully as Hill and the Wright brothers spent their own money. As the San Francisco Chronicle concluded at the time, the destruction of Langley's machine should put an end to congressional appropriations of any kind in every field of experiments which properly belongs to private enterprise. That remains good advice. Economic growth comes from entrepreneurs risking their own money, not from politicians risking your money. I'm Burton Folsom, professor of history at Hillsdale College for Prager University.
Why are you right? Yes, you, conservative person. Can you answer that question? I think it's so important that I wrote a book about it. How to be right, the art of being persuasively correct. Because if you can't be persuasive about why you are right, then we, the United States of America and the republic for which it stands, are lost. So here's the simple answer to why you are right. It is a more practical, generous, and compassionate way to live. Let me explain. There have been a bunch of academic studies on how those on the left and right approach problems. They pretty much all come to the same conclusion. The right tends to be risk-averse, more concerned about external threats, like tyranny and terror. Conservatives, get this, tend to be conservative. They are less likely to play with fire in just about every sense, financially, artistically, sexually. They are cautious about changing traditions, sometimes to a fault, which is why they cling to that crazy constitution they like so much and to their guns and their religion. We conservatives also focus on what we can fix and accept what we cannot, which is one of the many reasons we're not obsessed over global warming. With radical Islam, we know what the threat is, and that it's a lot worse than a few missing polar bears. I know that makes me sound mean. Sorry, polar bears. Liberals, the research tells us, are generally more outgoing, more likely to try new stuff. They're open to new ideas, though not school choice or flat taxes or a market-based healthcare reform, and are less likely to feel threatened by unfamiliar things. This is why, in general, they seem to have more fun. They're more likely to try drugs, for example, which is fine as long as they don't end up throwing up in my toaster. In short, liberals are pretty liberal. They feel free to take risks that the risk-averse usually end up paying for over and over. Which explains the necessity for conservatism. We are the cleanup crew. Liberals may seem to have more fun, and many do, but according to polls, they aren't as happy as conservatives. And with all the fun they're having, I've never quite figured out why the angriest people I've encountered in my life have been liberals. Maybe it's because short-term fun doesn't translate into long-term happiness. Marriage, families, and religion do that, and those are the things conservatives most value. Liberals tend to live for now, conservatives for later. A risk-averse conservative is more likely to save money. He is more likely to protect his investments. He is more likely to protect property and advocate for rule of law and preservation of individual protections. And he offers no excuses for looting. Instead, he empathizes with the Asian, Arab, and Black small businessman whose convenience store, laundry, or restaurant goes up in flames during the riot that liberals reflexively endorse as an understandable response to injustice. Of course, conservatives aren't risk-averse in everything, but they take risks with their own lives, not with the society. Conservatives risk all to build businesses. That risk, however, is rooted in a fact-based belief, not faith, in the free market. If people want the product or service you're supplying at the price you're asking, you will succeed and the risk will pay off. Over time, it's conservative risk-taking that creates a civilization by building families, businesses, and nations, all of which creates more wealth that can then be used to help those in need. You need money to make money, but you also need money to give money. Conservatism makes what liberalism takes. So for example, for liberals to get their minimum wage hike, first we need conservatives to build businesses, to think like businessmen, to sacrifice their own salaries in order to pay others, to sleep on floors, if necessary, in order to break even. Then, when they make a profit and things are going great, when the calm sets in, liberalism can appear and say, how dare you not pay these people a living wage? Once the tables are full of diners and bills are being paid and you're thinking about opening a second joint, liberalism arrives to demand its cut. Think of it as a protection racket, sort of like the Gambino family, but without loyalty, job prospects, and tracksuits. In short, conservatism doesn't compete with liberalism, it sustains it. Without conservatism, there is no liberalism. And so when a liberal asks you, why are you a conservative? Simply say, so that you can be a liberal. I'm Greg Gutfeld.
Try this at your next party. Ask your guests to define the term social justice. Okay, it's not charades or Twister, but it should generate some interesting conversation, especially if your guests are on the political left. Since everyone on that side of the spectrum talks incessantly about social justice, they should be able to provide a good definition, right? But ask 10 liberals to tell you what they mean by social justice, and you'll get 10 different answers. That's because social justice means anything its champions want it to mean. Almost without exception, labor unions, universities and colleges, private foundations, and public charities claim at least part of their mission to be the spreading of social justice far and wide. Here's the mission statement of the AFL-CIO, but it could be the mission statement for 1,000 such organizations. Quote, "The mission of the AFL-CIO is to improve the lives of working families, to bring economic justice to the workplace and social justice to our nation." In short, social justice is code for good things no one needs to argue for and no one dare be against. This very much troubled the great economist Friedrich Hayek. This is what he wrote in 1976, 2 years after winning the Nobel Prize in economics. "I have come to feel strongly that the greatest service I can still render to my fellow men would be that I could make the speakers and writers among them thoroughly ashamed ever again to employ the term social justice." Why was Hayek so upset by what seems like such a positive and certainly unobjectionable term? Because Hayek, as he so often did, saw right to the core of the issue. And what he saw frightened him. Hayek understood that beneath the political opportunism and intellectual laziness of the term social justice was a pernicious philosophical claim, namely that freedom must be sacrificed in order to redistribute income. Ultimately, social justice is about the state amassing ever-increasing power in order to do good things. What are good things? Well, whatever the champions of social justice decide this week. But first, last, and always, it is the cause of economic redistribution. According to the doctrine of social justice, the haves always have too much, and the have-nots never have enough. You don't have to take my word for it. That is precisely how a UN report on social justice defines the term. Quote, "Social justice may be broadly understood as the fair and compassionate distribution of the fruits of economic growth. Social justice is not possible without strong and coherent redistributive policies conceived and implemented by public agencies." Let me repeat that. Strong and coherent redistributive policies conceived and implemented by public agencies. And it gets worse. The UN report goes on to insist that, quote, "Present-day believers in an absolute truth identified with virtue and justice are neither willing nor desirable companions for the defenders of social justice." Translation? If you believe truth and justice are concepts independent of the agenda of the forces of progress as defined by the left, you are an enemy of social justice. Compassion, or social justice, is when government takes your money and gives it to someone else. Greed is when you want to keep it. The underlying point of social justice, then, amounts to a sweeping indictment of a free society. It suggests that any perceived unfairness or sorrow or economic want must be addressed by yet another government effort to remedy that unfairness, that sorrow, or that economic want. All we need to do is invoke the abracadabra phrase, social justice, and we're on our way. The invocation of social justice always works from the assumption that the right people, the anointed few, can simply impose fairness, prosperity, and any other good thing you can think of. And the only institution capable of imposing social justice is the state. And keep in mind, the conventional wisdom among liberal elites is that conservatives are the ones who want to impose their values on everyone else. The self-declared champions of social justice believe the state must remedy and can remedy all perceived wrongs. Anyone who disagrees is an enemy of what is good and right. And the state must therefore coerce them to do what is socially just. And that, as Hayek prophesied, is no longer a free society. Is that the kind of society you want to live in? If it isn't, beware of what will be done in the name of social justice. I'm Jonah Goldberg of the American Enterprise Institute and National Review for Prager University.
From the end of World War II, the United States and its Western European allies were involved in a nearly half-century-long titanic struggle with the Soviet Union, known as the Cold War. It was cold only in the sense that the Russians and Americans never came to direct blows, but it was certainly not cold for the Cubans, Koreans, Vietnamese, and others who got caught up in the communists' relentless drive to destabilize the free, democratic, capitalist world. There were, to be sure, many morally complex moments during this long struggle, but the Cold War was, at its core, as clear a conflict of good versus evil as World War II had been. Just like that war, the Cold War was a death match between the forces representing freedom and the forces representing totalitarianism. Because hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions, died in it, the Cold War can, with good reason, be described as the Third World War. The instigator of this war was Joseph Stalin, the mass-murdering dictator of Russia and of the many non-Russian peoples he had incorporated into what was known as the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or Soviet Union for short. Stalin knew that his Soviet armed forces could not take on the might of the Free West. Instead, he decided to wage this fight through the use of proxies, and by a massive use of disinformation and misinformation. His initial prey was Eastern Europe, the Baltic states, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, as well as Poland, Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Czechoslovakia. Stalin had troops in all these countries at the end of the war. Despite what he promised American President Franklin Roosevelt at the Yalta Conference, the Soviet leader had no intention of removing them, and gaining control over their governments proved to be quite easy. In March 1946, Winston Churchill famously declared that from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. When Stalin threatened both Greece and Turkey, President Harry Truman finally had enough. The so-called Truman Doctrine was born. The United States and its allies would not permit any further expansion of the communist empire. The Cold War was on. For the next 5 decades and across 4 continents, Europe, Africa, Asia, and South America, the US and the Soviet Union battled for influence, sometimes overtly, like in Korea and Vietnam, and sometimes covertly through their various spy agencies. But the moral lines of this battle never changed. The freedom of the West versus the communist tyranny of the Soviet East. There are, nonetheless, as there were even at the time, those who argue that the Cold War was an overreaction by the West, that the ambitions and strength of the Soviet bloc were greatly exaggerated, and that America, with its massive defense build-up, was just as responsible for the Cold War as was the Soviet Union. But this simply isn't true, as an immense amount of archival evidence from Russia, not available until after the Cold War ended, now proves. Nikita Khrushchev, Stalin's successor, stated Soviet intentions plainly in 1956. "We will bury you," he told the West. Nor would any amount of negotiation, détente as it was called then, have led to a just conclusion of the war. The American diplomat George Kennan rightly warned that short of becoming a communist country, there was nothing the United States could do to gain the Kremlin's trust. The Soviets could not be appeased, only contained. But even containment was an inadequate strategy. Yes, the Soviet Union could not have beaten the US in a head-to-head confrontation, but it didn't have to. Victory in the Cold War would have allowed it, through intimidation and subversion, to dominate the globe, making communism, rather than democracy and capitalism, the preeminent ideology. There were many times during the 5 decades of the war that it seemed like this would be the case. But thanks primarily to the strong leadership shown by Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and Pope John Paul II, the Cold War ended not with a bang, but a whimper. The Soviet Union was, at the close of the 1980s, to use historian Paul Johnson's description, a bewildered giant. Economically bereft, militarily exhausted, no longer able or willing to enforce its will. Communism had failed in every possible way, economically, politically, morally. It had tried to create a utopia on Earth and instead created hell for all of the nations that came under its sway. Yes, the forces of liberty eventually won the Cold War, but this triumph offers little consolation to millions who died or suffered needlessly through no fault of their own for a never viable and now badly discredited cause. I'm Andrew Roberts for Prager University.
If the Nobel Peace Prize was given out to people who truly made the world a more peaceful place, one group would win every year: the United States military. The U.S. Army, Air Force, Navy, and Marines. Now you may be thinking, how can you award a peace prize to a group whose purpose is to fight wars? Fair question. I'll tell you how. Because the reason we are free, the reason anyone on Earth today is free, is ultimately thanks to the U.S. military. They saved the free world from German domination in the First World War. They saved the free world from Japanese and German fascism in the Second World War. They saved the free world from communism in the Cold War. And they're saving it now. That might sound like an exaggeration, but only because they have protected us for so long. National security, the protection of citizens from an external foe, is not a given. Far from it. It's the product of the hard work of American military men and women who stand guard 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, every year. And they've been doing so for as long as any of us can remember. The First World War, the Second World War, the Cold War, the Korean War, both Iraq wars, the Afghan War. These were all conflicts that the U.S. tried to avoid. But they were wars that the U.S. fought not only for itself, but for good, decent, and free people everywhere. Where the U.S. military was not ultimately victorious, the Vietnam War, 50 million people were deprived of freedom of speech, of assembly, of press, of travel, and of religion. As many as 2 million more were brutally imprisoned and murdered. The only reason South Korea isn't an open-air concentration camp like its northern neighbor is because America came to South Korea's defense nearly 70 years ago. To this day, we still have 30,000 troops stationed there to protect the free South from the unfree North. And it's not just the open conflicts the American military resolves. It's the not wars, all the conflicts that were never fought because our adversaries feared the consequences of American military involvement. Let's put it this way. The reason Iowa soybeans can be shipped from Seattle to Shanghai, or coffee from Columbia to Cleveland, is because the American military, specifically the Navy, stands guard over the world's shipping lanes. Block those lanes and the price of everything skyrockets and international commerce grinds to a halt. Like it or not, the U.S. military has been and remains as close to a global sheriff as exists on planet Earth. On the beat, keeping the peace. Don't believe me? Ask yourself this very simple question. What if China disarmed? Or Iran? Or North Korea? Or Russia? Think the world would be a better or worse place? The question answers itself. Now imagine if America disarmed. Think China stays out of Taiwan or Hong Kong? Iran out of Israel? North Korea out of South Korea? Russia out of Eastern Europe? And those are just state actors. Islamists would quickly return bolder and more vicious than ever. In short, new conflicts would spring up and old ones reignite all over the world. Freedom would be in retreat every single day. That's the dystopian future of a world without the U.S. military. And that's because across the globe for the last 100 years and more, the bad guys have been thwarted. Not only by the American military, of course, but in every major conflict, American military force has been decisive. That's why when you meet a veteran, someone who served in the armed forces, you should thank them. We have even set aside a special day for it, Veterans Day. Not Memorial Day, that's for those who lost their lives fighting for America and for freedom. Veterans Day is different. It's for all those who risked their lives so that we could keep ours. If that's not worthy of a thank you, what is? So this year, put out a flag, call a veteran, someone who honorably served in the U.S. military, maybe your dad or mom or uncle or family friend, and thank them. Let them know that you are in their debt. We have been in their debt for so long, it's easy to take what they did, what they risked, and what they sacrificed for granted. We shouldn't. Veterans Day is meant to remind us. This year, don't forget. I'm Pete Hegseth, U.S. Army Major for Prager University.
Take a close look at this. Jonathan Haidt, the noted New York University psychologist, calls it the most important graph in the world. Why does he say that? Because he knows this graph reveals a simple, inescapable fact. There is no substitute for free market capitalism as a promoter of human prosperity. Let it be noted that Haidt is no one's idea of a conservative. But when hard evidence stares him in the face, he's not going to look away. The graph is based on the research conducted by the late British economist Angus Maddison. The numbers along the x-axis are years, 2,000 of them. The number on the y-axis are dollars, all of them, divided by the number of people on the planet. It's what's called GDP per capita, which is the world's economic output divided by its population. GDP is considered the best measurement of a country's standard of living, and in this case, the world's standard of living. Often when I show this graph to students, I get this comment, that's not capitalism, it's just the impact of the Industrial Revolution. So I show them another chart by the Madison Project. This one breaks the GDP hockey stick into regions. As you can see, there are a number of hockey sticks. But note that they don't rise at the same time. The United States surged first. Why? Well, in a very fortuitous coincidence, the year 1776 witnessed both the signing of our Declaration of Independence and the publication of a book called The Wealth of Nations by the Scottish economist and philosopher Adam Smith. In his book, Smith explained how to create a modern free market capitalist economy and the benefits of doing so. America's wise founders took Smith's principles to heart, and within a mere 100 years, the blink of an eye historically, capitalism turned the United States from 13 backwoods colonies into the world's largest economy, and it's held that position ever since. Western Europe shot up as well, but later. It rose steadily during the Industrial Revolution and then experienced a sharp rise after World War II when, between the end of the war and the mid-1960s, it fully embraced the free market. Japan too shot up after World War II, surpassing Western Europe for the first time, after the U.S. helped the Japanese transition to a democracy and a free market capitalist economy. Eastern Europe took off after it was released from the Soviet Union and socialism in 1991. China did likewise after the Chinese moved away from strict socialism and implemented some limited free market policies. One can only imagine where China would be now if its leaders had fully unleashed the forces of the free market. Yes, during this period of economic expansion, the wealthy got wealthier. That always happens when new wealth is created. But the middle class and the poor also greatly benefited. Here's another telling chart. This one is from the World Bank. In 1820, 94% of people lived in extreme poverty. Thanks to capitalism, by 2015, that number declined to 9.6%. Single digits for the first time in human history. Now, it's still too many, but if we're going to reduce the number even more, we need to understand what caused the decline. Free market capitalism. If we combine the Angus Maddison hockey stick chart and the World Bank data on extreme poverty, what we get is something quite amazing. Unprecedented global prosperity and an unprecedented decline in poverty. Across the globe, over the past 200 years. That's capitalism in a nutshell. One more chart. Johan Norberg, a Swedish economic historian, shows us how well ordinary people do when they work in a free market economy. Since 1990, hunger, poverty, illiteracy, and child mortality have all declined significantly with the decline of socialism. This all happened while we added 2 billion more people to the world. Far more people, far less poverty, better health outcomes, fewer babies dying. That's what economic freedom, capitalism can do. President John Kennedy, a Democrat, said it best. While making his case for significant tax cuts in 1963, he said, "A rising tide lifts all boats." Kennedy didn't believe that the poor only get richer when the rich get poorer. He believed everyone could get richer with economic growth. History's shown that he was right. This whole capitalism versus socialism debate is backwards. It's not those who advocate for free market capitalism who need to justify their actions. Rather, it's those advocating for socialism or any form of it who have a lot of explaining to do. I'm Andy Puzder for Prager University.
Thank you for watching this video. To help keep PragerU videos free, please consider making a tax-deductible donation.